The wind in the San Juan Mountains doesn't just blow, it howls like a wounded beast hunting for anything that dares to breathe in the high country. Deep in the winter of 1888, a young woman named Ivy Miller pushed through drifts that reached her waist. Her breath was a ragged ghost in the freezing air, and her hands were numb beneath her wool mittens. She carried a burlap sack like it was the most precious thing on earth. When she finally collapsed against a cabin door, a shadow moved inside. "Don't look away," she begged. He untied the sack, and his hands went still.
Welcome back to Rescued by the Reg. If you find peace in the stories of the Old West and the strength of the human spirit, pull up a chair. Make sure to subscribe and ring that bell. Today's journey is one of survival, secrets, and a redemption long overdue.
The peak of the ridge was a place where the world ended and the sky began. Up here, the air is thin and sharp, like a razor against the lungs. It was the kind of cold that the old-timers called the Great White Death. In the 1880s, folks in these mountains knew that when the mercury dropped, your body would start a silent war to save itself. First, the blood leaves your fingers and toes, rushing to guard your heart. If you don't find shelter, the mind starts to wander, and the snow begins to look like a warm bed. Ivy Miller knew the danger. She wasn't a mountain climber by trade. She was a daughter of the trail, a girl who had grown up watching the horizon for hope. But today, the horizon was gone. There was only the white wall of the blizzard and the burning ache in her calves. Every step felt like lifting a lead weight. She wore 3 layers of heavy wool, the only fabric that stays warm even when it gets damp. It was a lesson her grandfather taught her. Cotton is a curse in the cold, but wool is a lifeline. She kept her head down, following the narrow, rocky spine of the ridge. She was looking for a cabin that wasn't on any map. It was the home of a man who had turned his back on the world years ago. The wind tore at her burlap sack. Inside, something heavy shifted. She gripped the knot tighter. She couldn't lose it, not now, not after 3 days of climbing from the valley floor. Her vision was blurring at the edges, a sure sign that her body was losing the battle. She began to see things in the swirling snow. She saw a warm kitchen. She saw a flickering hearth. Then, through the haze, a dark shape appeared. It wasn't a dream. It was timber. Hand-hewn logs, notched with the precision of a master builder. It was the cabin. Ivy stumbled forward, her boots dragging. She didn't have the strength to knock. She simply leaned her weight against the heavy oak door and let out a soft, broken cry. The door didn't budge at first. Then the iron latch clicked. The door swung inward, and Ivy fell into the sudden, overwhelming scent of pine smoke and dried herbs. A pair of heavy, grease-stained boots appeared in her field of vision. A voice, deep and gravelly as a rock slide, spoke from above. "You're a long way from home, girl, and you're lucky you aren't a corpse." Tobias Thorne looked down at the shivering girl, but he didn't move to help her up. He was looking at the sack she held.
Tobias Thorne didn't move. He stood there like an old hemlock tree, rooted and gray, watching the girl shiver on his floorboards. In the 1880s, hospitality wasn't just a courtesy, it was a survival code. To turn a soul away in a high mountain blizzard was the same as pulling the trigger yourself. But Tobias had spent 10 years trying to forget the world, and the world had a persistent way of knocking on his door. He reached down with hands that were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who had built a life out of rock and isolation. He hoisted Ivy up and sat her in a heavy chair near the hearth. The heat from the fire hit her face, and for a moment the pain of returning circulation made her gasp. That's the thing about extreme cold. It numbs you, but the thaw always hurts. "Drink this," Tobias grunted, handing her a tin mug of pine needle tea. Now, back then, woodsmen knew that pine needles were more than just forest floor clutter. They were packed with vitamin C, 5 times more than an orange. It kept the scurvy away and cleared the lungs. Ivy took a sip, the bitter, resinous heat waking up her senses. Her eyes cleared, focusing on the man before her. He was taller than she imagined, draped in a heavy buffalo hide coat. His beard was a thicket of silver. "I didn't come for tea," Ivy whispered, her voice cracking like dry kindling. She reached for the burlap sack that had fallen by her boots. Her fingers were white and stiff, fumbling with the frozen twine. "I came because of what's in here." Tobias took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "Whatever you're selling, I don't need it. Gold don't buy wood, and silver don't stop the wind." "Don't look away," Ivy begged, her voice rising with a desperate edge. "Please, just look." She finally jerked the knot loose. The sack fell open. Tobias looked down, expecting perhaps a stolen watch or a bag of grain. Instead, his breath hitched in his chest. His hands, which had survived bear encounters and mountain slides without a tremor, suddenly went dead still. There, resting on the rough burlap, was a small hand-carved wooden horse. It was crude, smoothed by years of small hands rubbing the grain. Beside it lay a tattered quilt, stitched with a pattern known as the Wandering Foot. Tobias felt the air leave the room. He knew that horse. He had carved it himself 30 years ago for a little brother who should have been a ghost.
The silence in that cabin was heavier than the snow piling up against the logs outside. Tobias Thorne reached down, his fingers hovering over the wooden horse as if it might vanish if he touched it. Back in those days, a man didn't have many photographs to remember his kin by. Instead, we left our marks on wood and fabric. We carved our love into cedar and stitched our prayers into quilts. "Where did you get this?" Tobias's voice was no longer a growl. It was a hollow whisper, the sound of a man seeing a ghost. Ivy wiped the melted frost from her cheeks. "It belonged to my grandfather, Ben. He told me the story of the man who carved it, a brother who was the best scout on the Oregon Trail, a brother who went ahead to find water during the Great Dry of '58 and never came back." Tobias closed his eyes. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He remembered the heat of that desert, the thirst that turned tongues to leather, and the scout he had been, proud and reckless. He had found the water, but a rock slide had pinned him in a canyon for 3 days. By the time he'd crawled out and made it back to the trail, the wagon train was gone. He'd spent a year searching, eventually convincing himself they'd perished in the heat. He'd been living with that failure for 30 winters, hiding on this ridge because he couldn't face the sun. "Ben is alive?" Tobias asked, his voice breaking. "He's alive," Ivy said, her eyes burning with a fierce light. "But he's trapped. He's down in the Black Basin, 3 miles past the Eagle's Nest. The wagon broke an axle, and the fever took hold of him a week ago. He's got my 2 little brothers with him, Tobias. They're out of salt pork, out of cornmeal, and the wood is running low." In the 1880s, fever was a catch-all that chilled the blood. Without modern medicine, a simple infection or a bout of the flu could take a man down in days. Folks relied on elderberry syrup and cold compresses, but out in a broken wagon, those were hard to come by. "He sent me to find the ghost of the ridge. He knew it was you. He said nobody else could navigate the basin in a whiteout." Tobias looked at the Wandering Foot quilt. To anyone else, it was just scraps of calico. To him, it was the map of a life he thought was over. He looked at the girl, his own grandniece, and realized the mountain hadn't just brought him a visitor, it had brought him a mirror. "I'm a dead man, Ivy," Tobias said softly. "I've been dead since '58. Ivy stood up, her legs shaking but her gaze steady. "Then it's time you started breathing again, because if you don't move, my grandfather, your brother, is going to join you in the ground."
Tobias looked at the girl, then back at the fire. The wood popped, a pocket of sap exploding like a distant pistol shot. In the high country, silence is a heavy thing, but the silence between kin is heavier still. He wanted to say no. He wanted to tell her that the mountain had already claimed him, heart and soul, but the wooden horse sat on the table, a silent witness to a debt 30 years overdue. "The Black Basin," Tobias muttered, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "That place is a funnel for every nor'easter that hits the San Juans. If the axle is snapped, they're sitting ducks." In the 1880s, a broken axle wasn't just a mechanical failure. It was a death sentence. Without a forge or a seasoned wheelwright, you couldn't just fix a wagon in the snow. You had to harvest seasoned hardwood, usually hickory or white oak if you could find it, and shape it by hand with a draw knife. It was a labor of hours, and in a blizzard you didn't have hours. You had minutes before the frost took your fingers. "I can't lead you back down there, Ivy," Tobias said, his eyes casting shadows against the log walls. "I'm bad luck. Every trail I've blazed has ended in a graveyard." Ivy didn't flinch. She stepped closer, the heat of the cabin finally bringing a flush to her pale cheeks. "My grandfather spent 30 years telling stories about a man who gave up. He told stories about a man who could find a path through a solid rock wall if his family was on the other side. Are you that man, Tobias? Or are you just the ghost people say you are?" The sting of her words did what the cold couldn't. It woke him up. Tobias stood, his massive frame blotting out the firelight. He walked to a heavy cedar chest in the corner. He pulled out a pair of snowshoes made of bent ash and rawhide webbing. "If we're going, we move now," he barked. "The moon is transitioning, and that means the wind is going to shift. If we don't hit the tree line by midnight, the drifts will be 10 feet deep." He began throwing gear into a canvas pack. He checked his flint and steel, the lifeblood of any mountain man. In an era before reliable matches, keeping your char cloth dry was the difference between a warm night and a final sleep. He packed a tin of pemmican, a concentrated mixture of fat and protein that the indigenous tribes had taught the scouts to use. It was the original survival bar, capable of keeping a man moving for days on end. Tobias handed Ivy a heavy bear fur cloak. "Wrap this over your wool. We aren't just walking, girl. We're fighting, and the mountain don't take prisoners." He grabbed his heavy walking staff, notched with the marks of 1,000 miles, and blew out the lantern. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the dying orange glow of the embers. "Let's see if there's any scout left in these old bones," he whispered.
The door swung open, and the mountain air hit them like a physical blow. It was a blue norther, the kind of storm that could freeze the breath in your throat before you could swallow. Tobias stepped out first, his snowshoes crunching into the crust. In the 1880s, these ash-wood frames weren't just gear, they were a man's wings. Without them, a human would post hole into the drifts, sinking to the waist and draining their energy in minutes. "Stay in my tracks, Ivy," Tobias roared over the gale. "If you lose the line, you lose your life." They began the descent into the white. The world had turned into a swirling gray void where up was down and the horizon had vanished. This is where a mountain man's internal compass becomes his most valuable tool. Tobias wasn't looking for trail markers. He was feeling the tilt of the land beneath his feet and watching the way the stunted Krumholtz trees, the twisted wood of the high peaks, leaned away from the prevailing winds. "The wind is coming from the northwest," he shouted, his voice muffled by his scarf. "That means the drifts will be scouring the windward side and piling deep in the lee. We stay to the ridges until we hit the timberline." The descent was a grueling dance of gravity and grit. Ivy struggled, her smaller frame buffeted by gusts that reached 60 miles an hour. At one point, her foot slipped on a hidden sheet of glaze ice, a layer of frozen rain buried under the powder. She slid toward a precipice that dropped 500 feet into the canyon. Tobias moved with a speed that defied his age. He dropped his staff and caught her arm, his grip like a blacksmith's vice. He didn't offer a gentle word. There was no room for soft talk when the mountain was listening. He simply hauled her back and secured a length of hemp rope between their waists. "Tie a bowline knot," he commanded. "It's the only knot that won't slip under tension, but won't jam when it gets wet." They moved as one now, a two-person lifeline cutting through the chaos. As they dipped below the tree line, the wind began to moan through the ponderosa pines. The sound was haunting, a low, rhythmic thrumming. Tobias stopped dead in his tracks. He raised a hand, signaling for silence. He didn't hear the wind. He heard something else, a low, guttural vibration that wasn't the storm. It was the sound of a pack, and they weren't the only ones looking for a way out of the cold.
The sound wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the cracking of frozen timber. It was a low, rhythmic huffing, the sound of lungs working hard in the cold. Tobias felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. In the 1880s, the gray wolf was the king of the high timber, a shadow that moved with a collective intelligence that could daunt even the bravest scout. But Tobias knew a secret many didn't. A wolf isn't a monster, it's a survivor, just like them. "Don't run, Ivy," Tobias whispered, his hand dropping to the heavy iron hatchet at his belt, not to strike, but to feel the weight of his own resolve. "A predator's mind is a mirror. If you show them flight, they show you the hunt." Through the shifting veil of snow, yellow eyes began to blink into existence. 1, then 3, then 6. They were lean, their ribs showing through thick winter coats. This was the starving moon, the time of year when every calorie was a gamble. Tobias didn't reach for a weapon. He knew that in a blizzard, blood only brings more trouble. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a bundle of dried birch bark and a small tin of animal fat he'd rendered back at the cabin. "In the Old West," Tobias said, his voice steady for Ivy's sake, "fire isn't just for warmth, it's a boundary." He struck his flint against the steel striker. Clack, clack, spark. The tiny orange glow caught the birch paper. Birch bark contains a natural oil called betulin, which allows it to burn even when damp or frozen. In seconds, he had a torch flare up, casting a sudden, violent circle of light against the blue-white snow. He didn't swing it at the wolves. He held it high, claiming the space. The lead wolf, a massive male with a notched ear, tilted his head. He looked at the fire, then at the two humans, and finally at the deep exhaustion-filled eyes of Tobias Thorne. There was a silent understanding between two old ghosts of the mountain. With a low chuff, the notched-eared wolf turned, and the pack vanished back into the timber like smoke. "They're looking for easier prey than us," Tobias breathed, the adrenaline beginning to fade into a bone-deep weariness. The storm was peaking. They couldn't move further tonight without walking off a ledge. "We dig in," Tobias commanded. He led Ivy to a massive fallen cedar. They began to pile snow against the trunk, hollowing out a small cave, a quingy. "Snow is the best insulator God ever made," he explained, as they crawled into the cramped, quiet space. "The air trapped in the flakes keeps the heat of our bodies inside. It'll stay 30 degrees in here, even if it's 20 below outside." Wrapped in the bear fur cloak, huddled together for warmth, they waited for the dawn. The gray light of dawn filtered through the walls of their snow cave, turning the world into a chamber of pale blue marble. Tobias pushed aside the block of frozen crust he'd used as a door. The wind had died down to a rhythmic sigh, leaving the black basin draped in a silence so heavy it made your ears ring. "Up, Ivy," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The snow has settled. That means the ground is stable, but we have to move before the sun softens the crust and we start sinking." They descended the final slope into the basin.
This was the bottom of the world, a place where the shadows stayed long and the frost never truly left the soil. In the distance, tucked under the lee of a granite cliff, sat a solitary, lonesome shape. It was a Conestoga wagon, its canvas top shredded by the wind like a tattered ghost. As they drew closer, the devastation became clear. The wagon was tilted at a sickening angle. The rear offside wheel hadn't just slipped, the axle had snapped clean through. In the 1880s, the axle was the backbone of a pioneer's life. It was usually made of seasoned hickory, chosen for its memory, the ability to flex under a load and return to its shape. But even hickory has a breaking point when the frost enters the grain and the weight is uneven. "Grandfather!" Ivy cried out, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. A small, thin boy, no older than 10, scrambled out from under the wagon's floorboards. His face was smudged with soot, but his eyes lit up like lanterns. "Ivy, you brought him! You brought the ghost!" Tobias stepped into the cramped space beneath the canvas. It smelled of old grease, wet wool, and the sharp, metallic scent of sickness. Laying on a bed of pine boughs and old quilts was a man who looked like a withered version of Tobias himself. Ben. His skin was waxy, his breathing shallow and rapid. "The fever is deep," Tobias noted, his hands moving with practiced calm. He didn't have a doctor's bag, but he had the knowledge of the trail. He reached for a small leather pouch of willow bark. In the 1880s, we didn't have aspirin, but we had the white willow. It contained salicin, the very thing modern medicine would eventually use to break a fever and dull the ache. He began to brew a potent tea over a small, smokeless fire of dry aspen. As he tended to his brother, his eyes drifted to the broken axle outside. He knew that even if he saved the man, they were all still trapped. A wagon with 3 wheels was just a fancy coffin in the snow.
Tobias watched the steam rise from the willow bark tea, but his mind was already out in the snow, measuring the grain of the wood. Redemption, he realized, wasn't just about saying, "I'm sorry." In the Old West, redemption was work. It was sweat, blisters, and the willingness to fix what had been shattered. He stepped out of the wagon and knelt by the broken axle. The snap was jagged. In the 1880s, travelers often carried a spare tongue or reach, but rarely a full axle. To fix this without a blacksmith's forge required a futtock shroud or a splice and sleeve technique, a desperate bit of frontier engineering. "Ben," Tobias said softly, returning to his brother's side. The younger man's eyes flickered open, cloudy with delirium. "Tobias?" Ben whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. "You always were. A long time coming." "I'm here now, little brother, but I need you to hold on. I'm going to get this rig moving." Tobias turned to the 2 young boys, Ivy's brothers, who were watching him with wide, hollow eyes. "Listen close," Tobias told them, his voice firm but kind. "Survival isn't about being the strongest, it's about being the most useful. I need you to gather every scrap of iron you can find, barrel hoops, old hinges, even the spare linchpins. We're going to build a splint for this wagon." Under Tobias's direction, they began a process known as cold smithing. Since they couldn't melt the iron, they had to shape it by leverage and heat from the campfire. They found a sturdy piece of seasoned oak from the wagon's interior framing. Tobias used his draw knife to shave it down until it fit snugly against the broken hickory. He showed the boys how to wrap the iron hoops around the wood, heating the metal until it expanded just a fraction, then sliding it over the splice. As the metal cooled in the freezing air, it contracted, biting into the wood with a grip tighter than any bolt. It was a lesson in thermal expansion, a bit of science that saved many a pioneer from a winter grave. As he worked, the weight of 30 years of guilt began to lift. Every strike of his mallet felt like a prayer.
He wasn't just fixing a wheel, he was mending the line of the Thorn family. He looked at Ivy, who was tending the fire and keeping the children calm. She was the one who had climbed the ridge. She was the real scout. "The sun is dropping," Tobias announced, wiping grease from his brow. "The axle will hold for a slow crawl, but the ice on the river is our next problem. It's thin where the current pulls, and this wagon is heavy with all our lives."
The sun dipped behind the jagged teeth of the peaks, turning the snow a bruised purple. It was the witching hour of the frontier, when the light fails, but the work remains. Tobias stood back, looking at the patched axle. It was a rough, ugly fix, held together by iron bands and grit, but it was solid. "We move now," Tobias commanded. "The river is only a mile out, but it's the hardest mile of your lives." In the 1880s, crossing a frozen river with a loaded wagon was a gamble with the highest stakes. If the ice was black ice, solid and thick, you were safe. But if it was white ice, filled with air bubbles and slush, it had no structural integrity. The Black Basin River was notorious for its thermal springs that kept the ice dangerously thin in patches. Tobias took the lead, guiding the two draft horses. He didn't use a whip. He spoke to them in low, rhythmic tones. A panicked horse could shatter the ice faster than a falling rock. He taught the boys to walk 10 paces behind the wagon, spreading out the weight. "If the ice groans, don't stop," Tobias warned. "Keep the momentum. A rolling wheel exerts less pressure than a stationary one." They reached the bank. The river looked like a sheet of hammered silver. Tobias knelt down, striking the surface with his heavy staff. He was listening for the thud. A deep, dull sound meant thickness, while a sharp, hollow crack meant danger. "Stay in the center," he whispered to Ivy, who held the reins of the lead team. They started across. The wood of the wagon creaked as it hit the incline. Then came the sound every pioneer feared, a long, splintering pop that echoed like a rifle shot. The ice was bowing under the weight of the repaired axle. "Keep 'em moving, Ivy! Don't look down!" Tobias roared. He moved to the rear, putting his own massive shoulder against the tailgate, pushing to take the strain off the horses. He could feel the vibration of the water rushing just inches beneath his boots. In that moment, Tobias Thorn wasn't a ghost anymore. He was the anchor. He felt the cold water seep through a hairline fracture in the ice, soaking his boots, but he didn't flinch. With one final, agonizing heave, the front wheels hit the frozen mud of the far bank. The wagon lurched upward, clearing the shelf of the river just as a section of the ice behind them gave way with a sickening roar. They were across. They were wet, exhausted, and freezing, but they were alive. Tobias looked back at the dark water, then at the lights of the Silver Creek trading post glimmering in the distance. The ghost of the ridge had finally crossed his own internal river. The lights of Silver Creek weren't much, just a few flickering lanterns and the glow of a potbelly stove through a window. But to the Thorn family, it looked like the gates of heaven itself. They pulled the wagon into the livery stable, the air thick with the smell of dry hay and horse sweat. In the 1880s, the livery was the heartbeat of a frontier town, a sanctuary where the weary could finally trade the wind for a roof. Tobias helped Ben out of the wagon, carrying his brother into the back room of the general store. The thaw had begun. As the warmth of the room seeped into their bones, the tension that had held Tobias together for 30 years finally snapped. He sat on a wooden crate, his hands trembling as he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the small wooden horse. Ivy sat beside him, wrapping a dry blanket around his shoulders. "You did it, Tobias. You brought us home." Tobias looked at the toy, then at the man recovering in the bed nearby. "I didn't bring you home, Ivy. I was just wandering in the dark. You're the one who found the way." In the history of the American West, we often talk about the rugged individuals, the loners who braved the elements. But the truth is, the West was won by families.
by the threads of connection that refused to break even under the weight of a 1,000-mile trail. The Homestead Act of 1862 had promised land to those who could prove up a claim, but land meant nothing without someone to share the harvest. "I'm not going back to the ridge," Tobias said, his voice finally clear. "There's a plot of land by the creek with good soil and shelter from the north wind. I reckon your grandfather and I have some catching up to do. And those boys, they need to learn how to carve something better than a lopsided horse." Ben reached out a weak hand, gripping Tobias's forearm. No words were needed. The debt was paid. The ghost of the ridge was gone, replaced by a man who finally knew where he belonged. As the sun began to rise over the San Juans, the white peaks didn't look like a barrier anymore. They looked like a beginning.
There is a power in the things we carry, not just the sacks of heirlooms, but the memories that keep us moving through the storm. Tobias and Ivy proved that no matter how deep the snow or how old the grudge, there is always a path toward redemption if you have the courage to look for it. What did you think of Tobias's journey? Have you ever had a moment where an old memory changed your path? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to come home. Don't forget to subscribe to Rescued by the Ridge and check out our playlist for more tales of love, survival, and the Old West spirit. Until next time, keep your fire burning and your heart open. Be well, friends.